Okay, so I don't often do this, but this is kind of a response to one of my subscribers because he raised an issue that I think I would like to address. And this isn't, by the way, a personal attack on this subscriber because he's a reasonable guy. He always has intelligent comments. But he made a comment on my Tommy Robinson video where he made this analogy with the IRA not being representative of Catholicism, and therefore Islamist groups, which he took issue with, are not representative of Islam. This is a thing I have a big problem with, this analogy, comparing the IRA to Islamist groups, because there's a very fundamental difference there. The IRA were not predominantly a religious organization, i.e., they were not an organization that was inspired by, fueled by, or motivated by religious zealotry. I mean, don't get me wrong, I grew up in Northern Ireland. The IRA were a vicious terrorist organization that were responsible for thousands of dead and wounded. When you include the wounded, it goes into thousands. Um, and the Irish Republican groups were responsible for over all the deaths, were responsible for over half of all the deaths in the Troubles. So, in no way am I downplaying the IRA or the effect they had in that very small place. But I do take issue with analogies with the IRA, with the greatest respect, Frank, because you're not the only person who's brought this up, and I think it's flawed. And this is why there is that issue that they were not predominantly motivated by religion. It's true the civil rights issue in Northern Ireland was a big fueling factor of the initial troubles from, let's say, 1968 to the early 70s. That was a big recruiting tool for the IRA, particularly after Bloody Sunday. But the point is, it was always a territorial civil rights issue. You know, the IRA were never trying to get a sort of Catholic, they were never trying to get like a mini Vatican in Northern Ireland. It was never, I'm not saying religion wasn't a central part of the Troubles, obviously it was. The sectarianism between Catholics and Protestants, that was very real. And it was a very old thing, going back centuries. Um, But the IRA as an organization were not that religious. They weren't religious fanatics. You know, they didn't plant pipe bombs and kill British soldiers and kill British and Irish civilians and say we're doing this for Christ or we're doing this for the Pope. No, they were saying they were doing it for United Ireland. That was their primary thing. Now, that's a big difference from the likes of ISIS, Boko Haram, which has possibly killed even more people than ISIS, Al Shabaab, and any one of the countless other Islamist groups operating around the world. They are almost universally, whilst the specific conflicts differ slightly, they're universally motivated by a Pan-Islamist ideology. In the case of ISIS, to violently spread an Islamic caliphate. In the case of Boko Haram, to spread an Islamic caliphate within northern Nigeria and the West Africa region. So there is a very specific goal. You might argue that's territorial, but it's Islamic imperialism. It's a sort of manifestation of Islamic imperialism and certainly Islamic supremacy. But here's the thing: Islamism as an ideology is not just manifested by, because I think the issue that he was taking was that I was talking about these Islamist thugs that were going to the rally in Oldham, and he was saying he didn't like the term Islamist groups. Well, I think it's a valid term because I mean, okay, you could argue they're adrenaline fueled young men, but Islamism is a very real ideology. Okay, it's something that we can see in Islamic countries, and that was my reading of what you wrote. If I've misunderstood you, feel free to refute that in the comments or make a response video. But the reading I took was that you were refuting that Islamism is a wider phenomenon. I'm not saying that you're refuting Islamism itself. I know you're not, but I would argue it very much is a wider phenomenon because we see this manifested in nation states. Look at what's just happened in Brunei. Look at what happens all the time in Islamic countries with the state level persecution of minorities, because blasphemy laws are often used disproportionately against minorities. There's been attempts at the UN to enforce blasphemy laws. So I believe this is a worldwide struggle, comparable, if not in terms of mortality, certainly in terms of scale, to the rise of communism and fascism in the 1930s. I don't believe that's an exaggeration. Um, and I think that we, in secular democracies, left or right, need to recognize what's going on here. Because even in moderate Islamic countries, comparatively moderate, such as Indonesia, Malaysia, um, there have been real attempts to get this Islamist ideology pushed through. And it's subtle at first, but it goes down a slippery slope where that gets more and more authoritarian and theocratic. So, an example of this recently was statues of mermaids in Indonesia being covered up for being topless. That might seem like a trivial thing, but I think it's a sign of things to come, and I think it's a concerning situation, particularly in Indonesia, because Indonesia is the world's most populous Muslim nation. Um, So I don't agree that Islamist ideology is only manifested in terrorist groups and angry young men. That may be a big manifestation of it, but we see this in entire nation states. And when we see, for example, a polite face of Islamism in the UK, like the Muslim Council of Britain, they are, middle-aged men. They're soft-spoken. They're kind of the polite face of Islamism. They're never going to go out and riot or anything like that. They're generally responsible citizens. But the mentality that they promote, if you dig beneath the surface, it is Islamist. And given, if you give them the purest form of their argument, we would all be living under a theocracy. So because they would bring in blasphemy laws, that would be their final goal. That is the goal of Islamism, to try and put everyone else under subjugation through Islamic law. So that's why I take an issue with the IRA analogy to Islamist groups. I mean, another thing is the IRA was confined to one conflict in one part of the world. It's true there was international funding from the United States and elsewhere, but ultimately it was one conflict in one part of the world, the British Isles. Um, so that's another reason why it's a false analogy. If you look at Islamist groups, these are large scale conflicts claiming thousands and thousands of lives. The Boko Haram insurgency has claimed over 50,000 lives, and it's spilled into at least four countries: Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. So, ISIS, it goes without saying that's, they've claimed tens of thousands of lives. They've committed genocide against the Yazidi people. So I think the sheer scale of this is far, far bigger than anything the IRA done. And that's not to be insensitive to victims of the IRA, but the scale is totally different and it does matter. Um, so just to reiterate, I'm not saying that religion wasn't a factor in the Troubles. Of course it was. But that was not so much ideological. It wasn't so much, theological. It was more about civil rights, i.e., the Protestants being accused of having more basic human rights than Catholics, housing issues, and so on. That's more like a sectarian clash that has been seen in other parts of the world. Perhaps a better comparison would be Ambon. Ambon is a remote part of Indonesia which witnessed violent clashes between 1998, I believe, and 2002. About 2,000 people died in clashes between Christians and Muslims. That's far more comparable to Northern Ireland than the sort of Islamist insurgencies we're seeing around the world today. Um, so the Ambon conflict, if you look that up, I think that's has some similarities to the situation in Northern Ireland. It's not the same, but it's a better analogy than this argument that when people make, oh, you can't. And by the way, I've always been responsible when it comes to talking about Islam and Muslims. I would never say that Islamists represent all Muslims, but it is a simple, irrefutable fact. Then ultra conservative Islamic countries like Pakistan, there are some deeply, deeply intolerant views. And that is not just a few people, that is mainstream. Not all Pakistanis, but it is very widespread. I mean, there's just no glossing it over. When thousands of men were calling for the blood of Aisha Bibi, the Christian woman accused of blasphemy, they weren't terrorists. They were regular people, but they were Islamists. And this is the point I'm making. It is mainstream in Islamic countries. So we can't just pretend it's a fringe issue. It's not. It's very global, it's very large scale, and it's very real.